Well, my name is Amy Bond, and I'm the Executive Director of Perk, which stands for the Protection of the Educational Rights of Kids. We are a nonprofit here in California who is focused on protecting our kids, and we have a lot of concerns, and we're excited to talk today about those questions and concerns. We represent parents and children all across the state. And it's a very concerning time for all of us right now, and so we're actually really excited to have you with us. And Mike's going to introduce you as our guest, and we'll go right into our interview.
Thank you. And I'm Mike Bond. I'm on the advisory council for Perk. I'm also Amy's husband, and enjoy being involved in any proactive response to anything that's happening around us here in California. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Denis Rancourt. He is a researcher at the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. So you can go to ocla.ca there in Canada. He has a PhD in physics. He's a former tenured full professor from the University of Ottawa in Canada. He's published over 100 articles in leading science journals in physics, in the earth and environmental sciences. His reports about civil rights are featured on the OCLA website, and many of his articles and reports can be found at ResearchGate. He has written social and political commentary for Dissident Voice and other online magazines, and we are privileged to be able to have a few minutes with Dr. Rancourt today. So thank you.
I'm afraid it'll be more than a few minutes. It's my pleasure to be here with Perk, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I will try to tell you about my research that's relevant to your concerns, and so go ahead. I'm all yours.
All right, great. Well, I think that with the people that we represent across California, one of the biggest concerns we hear parents talking about is what is it going to look like when kids go back to school here? There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of questions, a lot of unknowns, and we wanted to find out from you, what are your thoughts about the pediatric population? How does the coronavirus impact them or not impact them? And maybe let's go there and talk about that to start with.
Well, with these respiratory diseases that are transmitted by aerosol particles in the air, they're always very contagious, just like the flu is. And so they do spread widely in the society, and that's normal. That is what flu season is all about. That's what these seasons are all about. It's seasonal in North America and in mid-latitude nations around the world, and it spreads. These diseases, although they're not very fatal, they are very contagious. They do spread the infection, and the great majority of people always throughout history develop an immunity to it from the infection, and then are well after that, and then are protected against that particular strain of that particular virus, usually the rest of their lives as a result of that infection. So that's how normally it goes. And this is, as far as I can tell, and all the leading researchers can tell, this is exactly that kind of a situation. This is something that spreads about the same as influenza would, and that attacks the same vulnerable populations, that is the elderly that have comorbidity conditions. And it does contribute to their morbidity under certain circumstances for those fragile people. So that's exactly what this is, just like any old seasonal flu. And it has therefore spread quite a lot throughout society, throughout the different states and into Canada and so on. That's normal. So
would you say that the pediatric population are at risk?
That's part of your question that I forgot momentarily there. Yeah, so children in this process, children do get infected. They do exchange germs at school, which is normal. And that's a great way for the infection to spread into society so that more and more people develop immunity. You want a lot of the people to develop immunity because that's how you will be able to protect the most vulnerable elderly people who have comorbidity conditions, is for everybody else to not be carriers of the virus that can infect others. So you want the majority of the healthy population to develop immunity so that the people that you want that want to avoid ever being infected because of their fragile state will not be able to get it from those people. That's how the two work together. That's how you protect the vulnerable people. Um, and in that chain of events, the children themselves are the least ones in terms of having to worry about this being dangerous for them. They tend to suffer the illness with far fewer symptoms and not as severely. And it's as you get older and older, it becomes more and more dangerous a disease. But children, most children will not even notice a difference in their health from being infected. They'll be infected, they'll develop immunity, and they will barely notice that they were infected.
So
That's how it is.
that actually would probably be really helpful for a lot of people to hear, because there is such a fear that, you know, we hear a lot of people talking about the fear of the unknown and how could it potentially affect the children. And then along with what you're talking about as well, what you're really saying is that allowing the children to have COVID-19 and allowing it to spread where they're not the risk group actually protects the more vulnerable. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, and that is clear, and that's well known, and that's well understood. All the experts, all the scientists, all the medical experts, we all understand this. You know, I'm not a medical doctor myself, as you said, I'm a physicist, but it's really well understood. This is how it works. You isolate the people who are vulnerable and who have comorbidity conditions, and you make sure that they are not exposed to this virus. That's how you protect them. And in the time that you keep them isolated, you try to develop what is the so-called herd immunity of everybody else. You let everybody else that is potentially going to be in contact with them, whether they're nurses or family or grandchildren, get the infection, develop immunity, and therefore become safe persons for those grandparents who are in homes and who are in the hospital. That's how it works. It's always worked that way. And it's still working that way despite the stupid things that the governments are doing. People are and have been largely infected and have developed immunity already. So when you do tests of whether or not you have the immune response in individuals, you find that the majority of people have probably a large fraction of them have already been infected despite all the distancing efforts that have been made.
That's a really great point. Did you have a question?
Yeah, and to follow up on that, that's fascinating. And so then this sounds to me like virology, and, you know, just typical illness 101. If we were to study that this is what we need to do, why is the dialogue different with COVID-19 from a you know, a perspective of being a physicist? From your perspective, what is different about the approach today that makes what you're saying less of common knowledge among professionals?
I think I understand what you mean. The virus itself is a real virus. You know, there's thousands of different kinds of viruses. There's many viruses in our bodies right now. They coexist. They've been there for a long time. There's, you know, we exist in an environment that's full of pathogens and bacteria and viruses, and we've co-evolved with them. You know, animals on Earth have co-evolved with viruses for billions of years, or animals, living things. And so and your immune system is this extraordinarily powerful engine that has always combated these pathogens. And it works very, very well. In fact, even vaccines themselves, that what they do is they try to trigger your immune system to respond to something before you get the infection naturally. So that's the normal state of affairs. Now, and this was a case just like that. It got blown out of proportion, and some influential players decided to take advantage of an event that happened in China, where some MDs saw some pneumonias, did particular tests, and identified what they thought was a new virus based on RNA measurements by PCR. That's a measurement method. It's always good for a medical researcher to identify a new pathogen and to be the first to describe it in the scientific literature. So there's a kind of a professional impetus to do that. And there were people dying from, in the particular hospital, dying of pneumonia-like symptoms. So they wrote it up, and then modelers took charge of it and said, what if this is the new killer? What if this? What if this? And made quite crazy extrapolations of the potential dangers and where this was spreading. And it could have just stayed at that level, but then I think some influential vaccine big pharma people convinced the World Health Organization that it would be a good idea to declare this to be a pandemic, even though there was no hard evidence that it was any more than an influenza-like disease. It was declared a pandemic, and then the mainstream media took over and said, "Oh my God, we're in the middle of a global pandemic now, et cetera, et cetera." And meanwhile, there was this industry of recommendations coming from all the experts, medical people who are influenced by big pharma, who have, big pharma has integrated and has captured the medical schools, the ideological thinking, the scientific journals. So the people in the profession tend to go along with these kinds of things. There's a procedure that's set up, if it's a pandemic, then we have to respond and so on. And so it just kind of had a life of its own. But if you step back and say, well, okay, but those crazy predictions of millions and millions of deaths and so on, they never turned out. And all the deaths, the fatalities, even the infection rates have slowed down. They're no longer exponential. They've slowed down. The curve has changed. There are many nations where it's not even an issue anymore. So it was studied more than the usual seasonal flu, and as a result, we talk more about it, and we mention every single death, and the media use that, and it frightens us. But in the end, there is nothing plague-like about this thing. In fact, I've got some hard data here that I want to show you, which is for California. And I was going to tell you about that data to explain that this is really nothing unusual or to be concerned about.
Yeah,
so,
please do, because I think a lot of Californians, it's hard for people to know what science they can trust or not trust. And the facts you see on the news or the media versus this scientist or that scientist or this doctor or that doctor, I think it's very difficult for people to know what's credible, who they can trust. They're hearing a lot of this narrative, and so we appreciate you bringing that up. So please.
Well, all the facts that you hear are generally true, but they're misused and they are taken out of context. For example, it's true that Mrs. So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so in a home died today in county. Okay, that's a true fact.
Yeah.
But how relevant is it? You wouldn't have heard about it even if it had not been declared a pandemic. Okay, right. And it would maybe their deaths would not have been attributed to COVID-19 under normal circumstances. True. But now there's a driving force to attribute the death to that. Even though the person had 3 other comorbidity conditions and was probably going to die within the next months, you're still going to attribute the death to COVID-19. And medical doctors are encouraged to do that. So there's kind of it kind of has a life of its own. So all the things you hear are all generally true as facts, but you have to put those facts into a context and into a perspective, and you have to understand how things are being distorted.
Right, that makes sense, which is why you were going to share with us what you found about California, which would probably be very helpful.
Yes. So please. I want to show you, see, what you have to know is that scientists who study these seasonal diseases and seasonal deaths, seasonal mortality, mortality is very seasonal in the mid-latitude nations on the planet. Scientists who study that, they know that you can't trust MDs to tell you what the cause of death is. You can't trust those darn death certificates because it's a very difficult task to correctly attribute the cause of death because typically the person will have all kinds of things that are wrong with their metabolism and so on. So it's very difficult to do. What is the main cause of death? And what was just an accompanying cause? And so it's a difficult thing to do. And so therefore there's going to be some politics involved. For
Okay.
example, yeah, you know, there's always politics because you have to recognize, and scientists know this, and medical researchers know this, the third leading cause of death in North America is medical error. You
Oh.
don't hear about that very much, but it's medical error. Okay, you got cancer, heart disease, and then the third one is medical error, and the fourth one is far below. So, but how often do you see that on a death certificate? Yeah, no, it's a medical error. You know, you never see it.
You really
Okay, so
don't.
that shows you the extent to which it's a political thing, how you attribute death.
You're
Okay.
right. You're
Okay?
absolutely right.
Yeah. So therefore, scientists who want to study this and want hard numbers, they don't trust the cause of death. What they look at is the hard numbers. And one of the best hard numbers you can look at is total cause morbidity.
Okay.
So just deaths counted on a per week basis in your state, let's say,
Okay.
okay, as a function of time. And so that's what this graph is that I'm going to show you. And I'm hoping I'll show it correctly so you can see it because we're working with my little camera here.
Okay.
But
You can see the years.
you can
Yes,
see
we
the
can see
years,
it.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that the total morbidity
Yes.
on a per week basis is varying with the seasons. So
Uh-huh.
every year it has a peak and then a trough, a peak and then a trough. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And that is typical. So people die much more in winter.
Right.
Okay.
As opposed to summer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Okay.
that's a great part of that is because of these viral respiratory diseases are transmitted by aerosol particles.
Okay.
And the aerosol particles are stable in the air and are part of the fluid if the air has is very dry. So if the absolute humidity is low, like it is in the winter, then the aerosols stay around for a long time. They're basically part of the fluid air. And then when summer comes and the air is humid again, those aerosols do not stay in the air and the disease cannot be transmitted. Okay, that is well understood. This science is hard science now. This is established that is the reason that these viral respiratory diseases are seasonal, is because they're transmitted by fine aerosol particles which are only stable in the air in a dry absolute humidity environment.
Wow. So what did you find
Okay.
for California then as you were looking into?
So we've
Great.
come back to California. So everywhere in North America, you've got these kinds of ups and downs in mortality. But what you find is this is the latest data right here in 2020. And you can see that every year there's a peak of mortality. Some years it's more, some years it's less. You tend to the people who are especially fragile will, will die in this season. And then following that, there are less especially fragile people. Okay, so you kind of pile them up in the summer in the sense that people are surviving. They're not, and then this thing hits, and then you get a lot of deaths, and then you get a low in the summer, and so on. So that's normal.
Oh,
And this is what the last season looks like, and it's perfectly the same.
so that's 2013 that you're pointing at.
Oh,
The
I'm at the wrong end of the graph.
far right would be the 2020. Yeah. So let's go to 2020.
Right.
You see
So,
New
and
York
you can
City on the
see
top.
there's an increase here of the baseline. That's just because
Okay.
the population's increasing with time.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And then here's the latest one. And this peak, I put an arrow there where New York City has this huge peak, okay, this anomalous peak. In California, there is absolutely nothing anomalous. There's nothing special happening. The peaks are all about the same, and they're different from year to year, but the COVID doesn't show up whatsoever.
Oh, wow.
This is
So
the
that's
latest data
Is that
within a
California?
week. This is for California, the whole state of California.
Wow.
In other words, there's nothing happening in terms of mortality.
Wow.
Okay, this is the latest data straight from the CDC for California.
Okay.
And it's total mortality. So that tells you that if something special happened in New York, then you have to try to understand what's special about New York, because it didn't happen anywhere else.
And I think that California is modeling a lot of their actions after New York. So I would love to hear what your thought is about New York, like what makes it different, and
Well,
why would California be an error to follow New York?
right. New York is a very unusual thing. The spike in deaths is very sharp, which is unusual in itself compared to these peaks I've been showing you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very localized in hospitals in New York,
Okay.
period. Okay. Now, I think there needs to be an investigation into what happened there in New York. I
Okay.
think you have a lot of people in hospital that were very fragile. And I think there may have been an over response of treatment because of the COVID talk. And
Okay.
in particular, the mechanical ventilators. There's a study that shows that it killed the critical patients.
To
Okay.
have the
And
ventilator, so when they intubated the patient, it made it worse, is what you're saying?
it killed them.
Okay.
Virtually, you know,
Yes.
the great majority of people that were put on mechanical ventilators died,
Mm-hmm.
and the ones that were not, that were just as critical, did not die overall. There's a scientific study that demonstrates that quite conclusively. So they were applying the wrong fix
Treatment
on
to
the basis that it was COVID. Some people say that, well, there was extra funding if you put someone on a ventilator, so there might have been an economic purpose behind it. But in any case, if I was running the state of New York,
mm-hmm.
I would do a criminal investigation into how this completely anomalous peak, which is really special of New York, and which you don't see anywhere else in any other state or virtually almost nowhere else, wherever there's a peak like that and it's affecting only people in hospitals, I think it needs to be investigated as to why that happened.
That's
But
very
it's a very small fraction of the overall picture.
mm-hmm.
Okay, it's a very unfortunate thing. It's a horrible thing. I'm still investigating it and researching it myself. And you see, almost everyone who died in a special care home or in a hospital.
Oh, right. So
Everywhere across the world.
mm-hmm.
Okay, no children died, no adolescents died, no healthy people died. It was
Yes.
all people who had comorbidity conditions in hospitals and homes, which is typical of these kinds of viral diseases.
Yeah,
So,
and one note just to make on that too, with the research Perk looked as we looked into these issues as well, we found it concerning that the payments that were given if you admitted COVID patients and also intubated them, that they were getting at least about a 15 to 20% increase from Medicare on just, and if they were called a COVID patient, then it was $13,000, I believe, on the payment, and if they were intubated, it was almost $40,000. So it's very difficult to not come to the conclusion that they were incentivizing.
there are systemic forces at play here. You've got a media frenzy, a declared pandemic, a media frenzy, and everybody playing into it, and many special interest groups who are profiting and who can profit from this a lot, including
Right.
vaccine makers.
Absolutely, yeah.
The vaccine makers that are going to be making billions of dollars by distributing a vaccine globally, they want you to believe this thing. So they want all the MDs and everybody to be talking about it as though it were an authentic pandemic that is plague-like.
Right.
But the numbers just don't show that.
The numbers don't add up.
No.
Yeah,
In
and
fact, I'll be curious to know in New York, right now, the few numbers that I have suggest that they had a really sharp peak, but then following the peak, the numbers went lower than normal, the deaths.
Interesting.
Okay? So it means they would have killed off some people who could have lived longer, weeks or months longer. And so there were less of these very fragile people to die in the following weeks. So it dips below the norm, if you like. If that pans out to be true, the preliminary data is suggesting that it would mean that there was in fact a procedure that accelerated the death of these patients.
Wow. See, that's,
momentarily created a sharp peak. But having said, I have to add something though.
yes.
That sharp peak, even in New York, if you integrate it, if you look at all the deaths for the year,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's not going to cause a big anomaly.
Wow.
Even locally, it won't. And even if it did cause one locally in just the city of New York, you can't count things that way. You can't say, therefore, it was a virulent disease. No, you're shipping people into those hospitals as well. You're taking people out of hospital beds to make room for them, and then you're bringing them in from the streets and so on.
Wow.
So when it's a local thing like that, you have to look at the process of, they died in hospital, they were brought to hospital, where were they brought from, how did this peak occur?
Right.
You can't look at just one city, you have to look at the whole state.
And
if you look at the whole state, there aren't more deaths than there normally would be, period.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really significant. And I think it's important also to take what you're talking about with how interventions or medical treatment or their advice or recommendations actually could have caused more problems. And I think that goes back to the pediatric population when we were talking about that, because what we're hearing is that the children